I should begin by mentioning that our speaker for the day, Professor Sreemati Mukherjee, is at present a professor at the Department of Performing Arts, Presidency University, Kolkata. She has been a Fulbright visiting lecture fellow at San Diego State University in 2011, and she has been very actively writing, discussing, sharing her valuable ideas on multiple fields of interest, including post colonial theory and literature, performance theories and theater studies. And among her recent most publications, I mention this particularly because I feel the listeners here should read this very interesting book. Uh, it's published from Hawakal publication, the many dialogues of the Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita. She has adopted a very interesting approach for analyzing Kathamrita, drawing upon Mikhail Bakhtin. And among her other recent most publications, she has a publication entitled The Theory and the Practice of the Performing Arts in Ancient India in the journal History of Ancient India. I should also add that she she has one of her articles on Rasosundari Devi's Amar Jivan published from Cafe Dicensus. And she, as I mentioned earlier, has been a very active translator as well. She has translated Alok Ranjan Dasgupta's Alo, Aro Alo as Light and Yet More Light, published from Obhijan Publishers. And she also has publications from reputed international publishers like Routledge, Amsterdam University Press, Pencraft International, Literaria Pragensis, Oxford Journals, JSL, and among the national journals, she has been published in journals by Jadavpur University Press, Indian Council for Cultural Relations, etc. I mean, I can go on, and I should also add that she is a wonderful singer as well, and she takes keen interest in making documentaries. One of her documentaries has been uh, screened in Kolkata International Film Festival as well. So we have a multi-talented person amongst us, and I cannot really thank her enough for giving her valuable time for this humble effort of ours. We primarily intended to focus or orient this lecture for the students' interest, but then at the department we thought that, well, the students' interest should not be something boring for general public as well, and the engaging speaker that she is, I'm sure, apart from our direct students here, the people I can already see faculty members joining from other institutions and students from various colleges, universities joining us across the country. So I am really happy to see that our humble effort has been taken positively by the audience, and of course we thank again our speaker for giving us a valuable time. But I will not take any further, but I would hand over the session to our respected speaker. As I told you, please cooperate during her lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the comment box. I would definitely read them out to her, but after her lecture. So, without further ado, ma'am, over to you. And thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Devaditto. Thank you. I also thank Manikchak College, the principal, and hello to Masood, who's also in this department. And I greet the students of Manikchak College, for whom this lecture was originally, the idea was to make the color purple kind of intelligible to them. Uh, perhaps it's a little, I mean, too far removed from their immediate contexts. So that may have been the idea that the faculty members of the Department of English had. Well, greetings to everyone who's here, other students and fellow colleagues. So without further ado, I'm going to start my lecture. It's entitled The Color Purple, Aesthetics and Politics. Now, nowadays, if you have to study anything, I mean, these are really the two terms that root a particular text, that provide an extremely convenient framework within which to locate texts. Perhaps the question of politics, although one's position, no matter what, is always political, but perhaps the question of politics was not such a pressing one or such a pervasive one at the time that Alexander Pope was writing, or even the Romantics were writing. I'm not going into their particular politics, but the politics of their position. But in a post-slavery world, I mean, although slavery was abolished in 1865, and that's 1947, the date of India's independence is much later than that, a century after that. But post-slavery is, there is a certain school of post-colonial thinkers who like to think of America also as a post-colonial nation. Hence, post-slavery and post-colonial. And feminism also is an important, let's say, feminist discourse is also an important area where the question of politics arises. I mean, these are my very prefatory remarks, actually. The question of politics arises, and many of you will be familiar with the catchphrase of the second wave feminism, the personal is political. The personal is political, and how valuable is that? And that women are equal but different. Because a lot of this politics of culture, politics of discourse, is predicated on the question of difference. And we are definitely going to study that today, because Alice Walker is not only a great novelist. The Color Purple is a revolutionary text, a kind of text that really marks a shift in, traditions of great writing, bringing in fresh parameters of how to look at a text and how to judge a text. So when the question of, let's say, writing back to the center, I'm using that particular phrase, the question, or when someone is writing from a so-called marginal position, say when an African woman who has to walk 5 kilometers to fetch water. Now, her positionality, she writes about feminism. She writes if she has something to say about feminism. Then her location is so very different from, say, a woman academic in one of the universities of the US. So the question of difference is very important. And the personal as political, my experience, you, whoever you are, the hegemonic center, the overriding center, are not really in a position to talk about me. And what we find in many such texts, another text that many of you, I mean, I'm sure almost everybody is familiar with, is Toni Morrison's Beloved. So many of these texts, I won't say that the color purple is revisionist historiography. Revisionist historiography for the sake of students rewriting history. Because history is often written from a dominant point of view. I mean, we have the subaltern historians, the school of subaltern historians who try to read the dominant history of the freedom movement, Indian freedom movement, against the grain by valorizing the peasant and the industrial worker, by valorizing horizontal movements vis-a-vis vertical forms of leadership afforded by persons like Gandhi and Nehru. So revisionist historiography is re-envisioning history, revising history, or re-envisioning history, where the coordinates, the parameters change. And it is important that they change so that the particular, that is that personal, is validated and valorized. So many histories, so many positionalities, so many ontologies. Let's respect them all. So I'm going to now start this discussion formally with a quotation, an invaluable quotation from Toni Morrison, where she talks about both aesthetics and politics. Quote, "The best art is political, and you ought to make it unquestionably political and irrevocably beautiful at the same time." Now, I personally am very sold on the question of beauty. I really like Coleridge's formulation about poetry, that science imparts knowledge, but poetry imparts pleasure. And I think that's a deep and fundamental distinction between, I won't say the arts, but between poetry and science, definitely. But beauty notwithstanding, politics is very important. So what I am going to say to you next is that for those who have read The Color Purple, you might recognize the quote, but if you haven't, then I'm alerting you to this quote in the text. It occurs somewhere down 3/4 of the novel, where Shug Avery, the blues singer and Seeley's lover, she enunciates an incredible philosophy of nature. I mean, this text, students, is concerned with the dismantling of, I won't say the Christian God, I will not say that, because Christianity was integral to Black existence for generations. I mean, when the slaves sat around the fire at night in the plantations, and from where the Negro spirituals and later on the blues singing comes from, they always consoled themselves by saying, singing, thinking that they were low on earth to be high in heaven, that when they went to heaven, God would look after them. This is how the Blacks console themselves. So it's not like the Christian God is being demolished. But, I mean, one can't deny, I mean, I haven't read the Bible, frankly, but one cannot deny that the Bible has been an instrument of white culture. I mean, even in our country, in a very pervasive manner. One can't deny that. So Seeley is the protagonist of this novel. She's a black woman, a girl. The novel starts, no, it's in retrospect. It's not like she starts writing when she's 14 years old, but it is in retrospect. And it starts by it's in the epistolary format. Few remarks about the text. The book is in an epistolary format. And regarding, there are letters, Seeley writes to Dear God initially, and then her sister Nettie writes to her, Dear Seeley, after many years, And towards the end, God doesn't, there are no more dear God letters. They are all dear Nettie letters. Except the very last letter, which I hope to read out to you, is where God becomes part of uh, this celebration of life, of nature, of community, of love, and of sisterhood. So, another very important figure in this novel is that of Shug Avery. Shug Avery was a blues singer. Celie, at age 14, was raped by her stepfather. Her mother was kind of almost crazy and worn out by giving birth to multiple children. And Celie and her sister Nettie thought that the man they lived with was their father. And that misconception is removed much later in the text. So for Celie, at age, and she was very ugly, and she herself says that I am extremely ugly. So for Celie, at age 14, she had to deal with the earth-shattering notion and experience of having her own father rape her. And this happens in another book by a Black woman author, Toni Morrison, The Bluest Eye, where a young Black girl thought that if she had blue eyes like Shirley Temple, then that would take care of all her suffering in the world. People would not mistreat her anymore. Whites would not mistreat her anymore. So, going back to this question of incest or rape by the father, she has children by him. I am not reading out the first letter. It is very, very explicit. It describes the action of what her father did to her. And I don't really want to read that letter out to you. But I will be reading other letters. And when her mother, she has children. So when her mother asks her, whose child is that? She says, God's. I'm going to read that part of the text out to you. All right. Dear God, the novel starts with this line. You better not never tell nobody but God. It would kill your mammy. So central concern as the novel opens is that the mother should not be hurt. Amit, you need to close your video, please. Okay. So it starts. I mean, I'm not going to read the whole letter, but you will see how innocent she was. The first letter starts. I'm just reading out the first paragraph. Dear God, I am 14 years old. I have always been a good girl. Maybe you can give me a sign letting me know what is happening to me. Now, most of you in this audience have read Riders to the Sea. So even in Riders to the Sea, although the young priest assures Moria that God would not take all her sons, she does lose all her sons. So it seems like the promises of a Christian priest don't hold good in the kind of, in the kind of extreme world that Riders to the Sea presents. So in a similar manner, the God of this text is really an absence. And it is a he, and he does nothing for her. And when Shug Avery, you know, there's a wonderful passage, I mean, a couple of passages where there is this magnificent celebration of nature as God. So Shug Avery also does not relinquish or believe in God, but she says God is everything beautiful and God is nature. So there, they dismantle the idea of a white man who was very old and who had long hair. So that notion of a Christian God is dismantled in this text. Now, having said a little bit about the text, I will like to take this discussion in a slightly different direction. So, the introduction of the color purple in the text, it is in that same section where Shug Avery celebrates nature. Quote, I think it pisses God off if you walk by the color purple in a field somewhere and don't notice it. End quote. So this color purple is actually the color black. And it is not in an obvious, strident manner, but it is celebrated throughout the text. There are references to characters who are very, very black. And there's also an African subtext to this text. Africa is also woven into this text as part of, and I'm coming to that soon, as part of a Black cultural tradition. And the Africans are, Nettie, the sister, goes to Africa. She says they were very, very black. They almost had a blue sheen to them. So now what I would like to do is provide a kind of historical background to the 80s, which is when Alice Walker writes her novel, 1982. I mean, this discussion will not have meaning unless I take you at least 2 decades or 1 decade back to outline to you how this question of black is beautiful first makes its appearance in the cultural discourse of black thinkers, aestheticians, and theoreticians. So, again, many of you might know that the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King, that started in 1955, and that happened, students, you will find this very interesting, is that a woman called Rosa Parks, she refused to give up her seat to a white man in a bus in Alabama. It was the Alabama-Montgomery route, a particular route. So in Alabama, I mean, the color purple is also set in the South, probably in the 1950s, because there's mention of a folk singer called Bessie Smith, and Bessie Smith was singing in the 50s. It's not specified which particular state, but it's probably Alabama or Georgia. Anyway, so Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man because segregation was an institution of American society. Blacks went to black schools, whites went to white schools. There was areas in a restaurant where only blacks sat. And then in the bus, there were certain seats where blacks sat and they were not allowed to sit in other places. So Rosa Parks does not give up her seat to a white man. This is 1955. Focusing on that, or let's say, using that as a springboard, a number of black activists, they start the civil rights movement. I know Martin Luther King was very influenced by Gandhiji, by this non-violent, non-cooperation strategy. And in 1964, the Civil Rights Bill was passed, whereby it was at least stated constitutionally that everybody was equal under the law and there would be no discrimination based on color, sex, and religion, and a few other things. So the color angle is important to me, and I think it's Kennedy who passed that act, and that Kennedy was involved in this, and Kennedy, you know, was murdered because of his involvement with with desegregation. So the civil rights movement began in 1955 and ended in 1968. Shortly after the civil rights movement began, let's say in the 60s, but really kind of powerful around 66, 67, 68, were the twin movements, Black nationalism and the Black aesthetic movement. I do note what I'm saying, Black nationalism and the Black aesthetic movement. So the Black aesthetic movement was the cultural arm of Black nationalism. At that, there were many intellectuals who were part of this movement. Some of their names are Amiri Baraka, Larry Neal, Addison Gale Jr., and there were others, and I will be quoting from their works soon. So Amiri Baraka, for instance, he had an American name, but he purposefully chose an African name to go by. So the Black nationalists were very aggressive about their Black identity. Like that catchphrase, personal is political, like that. One of their catchphrases was, Black is beautiful. And you get that in the color purple. In the reference to the color purple, and also to very artistically introduced the color black in certain contexts, the skin color of certain people, okay? So going back to Black nationalism, it was a very aggressive movement to validate Blackness, to validate Black cultural tradition, and to kind of say, theoretically, and maybe even in practice, that Blacks should not assimilate, should not integrate with the dominant white culture. They were a separate nation within America. That's why Black nationalism. Later on, it gives rise to certain violent groups like the Black Panther movement and other groups like that, which I'm not getting into. But Black nationalism meant a very aggressive African-American kind of claiming of identity, and to refuse to refusal to assimilate white values and be part of white culture. And that necessarily meant establishing a Black tradition. And for that, they went to their African roots. So African hairstyles, that's still prevalent in America. I don't know if the dreadlocks also go back to the Caribbeans. Many of them have, it's maybe a Caribbean style, the dreadlocks. Then African dress, African decor. So it was a time of a kind of militant culture in a fairly militant form. Now, I will read out to you short excerpts from these theoreticians who were pivotal in framing the Black aesthetic, the values of the Black aesthetic movement. Okay, so I have this poem by Amiri Baraka. The title of the poem is Black Art. Black Art, and it's 1969, written in 69. And I quote, "We want a Black poem and a Black world. Let the world be a Black poem, and let all Black people speak this poem, silently or loud. Then Addison Gale Jr., his essay is entitled The Black Aesthetic. I'm not quoting from there, but he is the one who comes up with the line, Black is beautiful. So Black is beautiful, and he exhorts writers to find positive images of African American life, life of struggle and achievement. Okay. Then, we have poets, women. I want you to note this, that women were not at all central in this I won't say Black nationalism, the Black aesthetic movement. They did not play any kind of leading role. We don't find any essays written by women. We just have these two poets, Sonia Sanchez and Nikki Giovanni. So in a poem by Sonia Sanchez called Homecoming, I'm just reading out, just giving you one image from there. She writes, Black niggers, my beauty. All right. And from Alice Walker, I have this written here. Black as anything and skin just as smooth, while she describes someone. Okay. So I will now read out to you from Larry Neal's essay, The Black Arts Movement, 1968, written in 68. I quote, when we speak of a Black aesthetic, several things are meant. Essentially, it consists of an African-American cultural tradition. The motive behind the Black aesthetic is the destruction of the white thing, the destruction of white ideas and white ways of looking at the world. The new aesthetic is mostly predicated on an ethics, very important. Politics. So ethics, which asks the question, whose vision of the world is more meaningful, ours or the white oppressors? Black intellectuals of previous decades failed to answer these questions. In the context of world upheaval, so see, this is where the colonialism angle, I feel, comes in, that he's referring to that. In the context of world upheaval, ethics and aesthetics must interact positively. So there you go to my title, Aesthetics and Politics. So instead of politics, read ethics. So ethics and aesthetics must interact positively and be consistent with the demands of a more spiritual world, So Walker's world is a very spiritual world, finally. Consequently, the Black Arts movement is an ethical movement, ethical from the point of view of the oppressed. So this question of oppression, the need for answering back, celebration of Blackness and Black cultural traditions. Now, I will now say something that students will find useful for framing their answers. That is, this is not a very uncommon, critical framework, but nonetheless, I'm going to put it out there. In Woman Native Other, Trinity Minha gives us a certain paradigm. She says that every text, or every writer rather, should be located at the intersecting point of these four coordinates: race, class, gender, and historical context. So think of the world post-colonialism. I mean, race is certainly a very explosive factor. So is gender. I mean, lots of women writing. In the 19th century in Bengal, women writing. In Africa, women writing in the 60s, 70s, 80s, writing journals, writing diaries, writing autobiographies. So there's a term called double autorité. It's a French phrase used by a Caribbean critic of Caribbean literature called Renée Larrière, where she says that African women writing their autobiographies themselves, there's an inscription of a double authorship. their own experiences written in their own hand. So this writing in one's own hand, and this was important post-slavery too. I mean, you have slave narratives. You have the what is it? The narrative of the autobiography. The autobiography. Uh, the autobiography of an ex-slave written by himself. This was very important, written by himself. So we are going to come to this question of writing now in The Color Purple. So I just want you to remember these coordinates of race, class, gender, and historical context. And that is why I outlined the historical context for you. Okay, so now the next point that we are going to now, discuss is that, as I already mentioned, that in the Black nationalist movement, even in the Black aesthetic movement, there were no women theoreticians. Women, they had no voice. One doesn't hear their voices. And the two privileged genres of this movement were poetry and drama. Now, both poetry and drama have a kind of, if you recite poetry, say in a street corner or in a bazaar, I mean, that has a certain immediacy that a novel doesn't have. And we all know that. I mean, novel is very strictly a scripted tradition genre. So the two privileged genres, because they wanted, like our street theaters, the IPTA street theaters, street theater, of course, ideological, and you enact it in the street, people gather, and you're able to convey your message. And the theater still remains perhaps the most immediate, genres, I would say. So poetry and theater were the the privileged genres of the Black nationalist movement. Now we find that in the period that follows, say in the 70s and the 80s, there were many women who were writing, Black women who were writing. And they chose the novel in which to write. So there's this coming together of gender and genre. And the novel is something that women have always found congenial. And so this coming together of gender and genre. But the thing is, what kind of writing? It is a kind of writing, novel writing, in which the speaking voice is very, very prominent. It is a scripted tradition, no doubt, but orality is very powerful in writing done by both Alice Walker and Toni Morrison. And there is another writer of that period called Paul Marshall, from the poets, The Making of a Writer, from the Poets in the Kitchen, Paul Marshall. I shall have more to say about that eventually. So in both Morrison and Walker, you get the voice, the Black voice speaking. Morrison, in one of her interviews, says, somebody asks her, what is distinctive about your fiction? And she says, the language, only the language. The language must be careful and must appear effortless. It is the thing that Black people love so much. The saying of words, holding them on the tongue, experimenting with them, playing with them. It's a love, a passion. Its function is like a preacher's, to make you stand up out of your seat, make you lose yourself and hear yourself. The worst of all possible things that could happen would be to lose that language. So orality, and she says, my novels are oral, A-U-R-A-L, meandering, etc., etc. Now the thing is that, I mean, even after we acknowledge that, we can't deny that the novel belongs to a scripted tradition. And the manner in which Virginia Woolf um, does again a kind of revisionist historiography in writing A Room of One's Own, where she goes in search of women's traditions of writing, but scripted. Alice Walker, in her groundbreaking essay, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, goes in search of women's traditions, Black women's traditions, that can be, and if you want to put a history together, that can be located in activities like quilting and singing and gardening. Now, I will come to that. I just start many strands. Anyway, so going back to the question of script versus orality. So the novel is a scripted genre. So how does Walker bypass this? The ignorant Black girl woman, Celie, in the color purple, writes as she speaks, which is oftentimes a very, very incorrect English. The grammar is incorrect, the spelling is incorrect. It's very phonetic. Like asked, A-S-K-E-D. The word is asked, A-S-K-E-D. So she always writes asked, A-S-T. So because that is the change that standard English has gone through in Black speech. So now I want to draw your attention to the very obvious politics of language that you're getting in the text. Alice Walker is one of the most highly educated of persons. But when she wrote her novel, and her protagonist was a poor, ignorant Black girl woman, she has the woman write as she speaks. Now, I'm going to read out from a section in the novel. It's very moving, very beautiful. Celie runs into her daughter. I mean, her children were taken away from her. Now, I want to read this first. Okay, so this is the part where we come to know that her children, she says that her children were killed. Dear God, my mama dead. My mama is dead. Not is dead. My mama dead. She dies screaming and cussing. Cursing is cussing. C-U-S-S-I-N-G. She scream at me. She cuss at me. I'm big because she's pregnant with her stepdad's child. I'm big. I can't move fast enough. By time I get back from the well, get back, G-I-T, get back from the well, the water be warm. By time I get the tray ready, the food be cold. By time I get all the children ready for school, it be dinner time. He don't say nothing, that's the stepdad. He sat there instead of sit there, by the bed, holding her hand and crying, talking about. Don't leave me, don't go. There are no apostrophe marks or anything like that, it's just goes on, runs. She asked me, A-S-T, she meaning the mother, she asked me about, B-O-U-T, about the first one. Whose it is? I say God's. I don't know no other man, or what else to say. When I start to hurt, and then my stomach start moving, and then that little baby come out, my chewing on it, fist, you could have knocked me over with a feather. So, this is a real politics of language. That the rules of standard English grammar and spelling are deliberately subverted. That is, the difference of Black women's writing, the difference of our writing. I mean, black men also have not written like this. You know about the book, The Mad Woman in the Attic. You know about the essay, Infection in the Sentence, where Sandra Gilbert and Susan Goober write about how then of course it was the white woman, how the white woman writer of the 19th century had to struggle with the question of style, how to write. Should we write like the way men have written? So this question of how to write, and all authors face that. So black men, Richard Wright, for instance, wrote standard English. Ralph Ellison in the 1950s wrote standard English. So this is black women's writing predicated on difference, that the oral becomes the written, proving a point about black culture, and also creating a kind of new path for language, where the oral form is validated through the written. Okay, so then finally, she asked, she meaning the mother, where it is, the baby. She says, Celie says, I say, God took it. He took it. He took it while I was sleeping. Killed it out there in the woods. Killed, K-I-L-L-E-D. So she spells it as K-I-L-T. Killed it out there in the woods. Killed this one too, if he can. So she thinks that our children have been killed, but actually they weren't. They were given up for adoption. Not exactly adoption, but they were given to a black preacher. So now Celie, the section that I'm going to read now, she's gone into town. She's married now to a man who did not wish to marry her, but who wished to marry her sister. And I found something very odd here, maybe. Well, these very senior, not senior, but like really grown-up men, they fancy these little girls. The man that Celie married actually wanted her sister Nettie, who would probably have been 11 or 12 years old. So it seems that there is another strand here. That is, the black nationalists wanted to present a portrait of black culture or of black society as very unproblematic, in the sense that none of this kind of incest, broken families, none of this. And there was an attempt at creating a new black man who was in a certain kind of way divorced from history, because the history of the black man, the continuum of experience, is a terrible one of emasculation, especially of emasculation. If you read Beloved, then you will see the kinds of things that happened to slaves, and they didn't have names. Naming is, and very important thing is that in this text, in The Color Purple, no man is named. Because naming is a huge prerogative. If we go back to the age of Descartes and the neoclassical period, the period when in Europe, when science makes such rapid strides, that was the age of naming. All the names were given by white men, white scientists, anthropologists, historians, and so on. So naming is a huge prerogative, and blacks didn't have it. I mean, again, in one of her conversations, Toni Morrison says that we were not allowed to name ourselves. That is a huge psychological scar. So the men in plantations, they had names like Paul A, Paul B, Paul C, Paul D, taking after the owner's name, Paul. So going back to what I was saying with black nationalism, that they presented a kind of ahistorical image of the black man. Women didn't really figure very much in these utopian visions of society, history, whatever. But in the writing by these black women, you get the truth of black lives. Very bold, very unashamed, very frank kind of portrait. This question of incest, it comes up several times. And the fact that all these grown men, they fancied these little girls. So she goes to town, and there she sees a little girl who she thinks is her daughter. So I'm just reading out from there. Dear God, I was in town sitting on the wagon while Mr. Dash. All the men are Mr. Dash. There's no name after them. But all the women are named. Mary Ann, Nettie, Shug Avery, Sophia, Henrietta, all the girls and all the women have names, but none of the men do. So that's, again, it's politics. It's a feminist politics here. So I seen my baby girl. I knowed it was her. She looked just like me and my daddy. Like more us than us is ourselves. She be tagging along behind a lady, and they be dressed just alike. They pass the wagon and I speak. The ladies speak pleasant. My little girl, she look up and sort of frown. She fretting over something. She got my eyes just like they is today. Like everything I seen, she seen, and she pondering it. So Celie is occasionally, actually not just occasionally, often very profound. Debadito, how am I doing time-wise? I need to know that.
It's almost 1 hour, but feel free to continue. We don't have a problem.
Okay, then I can do that. I'll just get a sip of water.
Yeah, please, please.
Okay, so now this I've been able to introduce you to this question of the politics of language, and there are many dimensions to this politicization of language. There is a book by Henry Louis Gates Jr. called The Signifying Monkey. Gates is, of course, advancing something very sophisticated, which is not really applicable to this text, but he says that blacks have their own language, and that language often means words. The way the blacks may use the English language, they can create completely different meanings than the ones in standard English. There's always a question of black language vis-a-vis standard English. There is a famous essay by a black feminist theoretician called Mae Gwendolyn Henderson. I think the name of the essay is Speaking in Tongues, Dialectics, something, where she is from the Caribbean, from Jamaica, and she says, we learned one kind of English at school. She went to a good school. So we learned one kind of English in school, and then we spoke another kind of English at home. And then when I came to White Columbia, I had to write in a particular kind of way. So she says that blacks are introduced to many tongues, speaking in tongues, and that, you know, in a kind of Bakhtinian heteroglossia manner, it enacts a kind of dialogue. Dialogue. So that's that. And Gates says that the way that they can use the English language is that the standard English sentence means something, but then they will probably use the same words and use it in a way where a certain context of exploitation, oppression comes across through the same words. So, we've looked at this question of the politics of language. Now I'd like to introduce you to the question, and we've also looked at orality, that the oral is a very powerful dimension of the writing of Black women in the post-Black nationalist movement era. In the novel, I mean, re-envisioning the novel, recasting the novel, reframing the novel with a difference. And in fact, Black feminist criticism also comes out of this. Now, I would now like to introduce you to the essay In Search of Our Mother's Gardens by Alice Walker, which is a groundbreaking essay. In it, she says that her instinct for poetry, her instinct of beauty, was entirely the legacy of her mother, who was extremely poor, who had many children, who worked backbreaking labor throughout the year. But when spring came, then she would go out into her garden and plant flowers. And her garden was one of the most famous in Georgia. So this is where this philosophy of nature, we are introduced to it, and that surfaces in Alice Walker's own novel, The Color Purple. And the reason why I feel that mentioning this essay is important is that if orality marks the artistic and critical, not critical in that way, but the artistic endeavors of Black women writers, writing the novel particularly, then the other thing that is important is the matrilineal. In search of the mother, in search of women's traditions, in search of the matrilineal is a very, very important part. Perhaps not so much of Toni Morrison, but definitely of Alice Walker. This text, The Color Purple, is an intensely woman-centered text. There are men, but they are kind of absent. Their names are not mentioned. Now, what are people if they don't have names? And all these women who appear in various states of distress, privation, nobody except Shah Avery, the blues singer, is well off or doing well. But their particular ontologies, their particular situations, their struggles, hopes, aspirations, all that is clearly mentioned, if not developed, but at least mentioned in the novel. Now, so going back to this question of the matrilineal, Black women critics have tried to position themselves, Black women academics, Black women critics, Black women writers, especially Walker, has tried to position herself within a woman's tradition of artistic creativity. In Search of Our Mother's Gardens is a rewriting or a re-envisioning of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. But whereas in A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf extremely disappointed to see that there were such few books by women writers in the British Library, she goes in search of women's traditions. But she does of scripted traditions, women writers. But Alice Walker, she rewrites Woolf by trying to find creative ancestors, ancestors in all forms of creativity. So she locates these ancestors, women artists, in activities like quilting, storytelling. So that's where Paul Marshall comes in, from the poets in the kitchen. Paul Marshall, another black writer, she said that I always heard the women in the kitchen telling stories. And that is where I learned to tell stories. So always a question of a woman's tradition. So, Walker sees that tradition to exist in quilting and also in singing. And she mentions Aretha Franklin, she mentions Bessie Jones, and great blues and jazz singers, black women singers. And she says that if they could sing like this, then how do we know what our foremothers could sing like? She said they could not express themselves. Their lives were so determined, over-determined by poverty and privation, that they could not express themselves artistically. But had they been able to express themselves artistically, then they would have been artists like Bessie Jones and Aretha Franklin. But she still finds proof of creativity in quilting, and this is what she has to say about her mother. I would like to read this out to you. Okay. I notice that it is only when my mother is working in her flowers that she is radiant, almost to the point of being invisible. Except as creator, hand and eye, she is involved in work her soul must have, ordering the universe in the image of her personal conception of beauty. Her face as she prepares the art that is her gift is a legacy of respect she leaves to me for all that illuminates and cherishes life. She has handed down respect for the possibilities and the will to grasp them. This ability to hold on, even in very simple ways, is work Black women have done for a very long time. Finally, guided by my heritage of a love of beauty and respect of strength, in search of my mother's garden, I found my own. So this is, the matrilineal in an extremely resonant and powerful form. And the color purple is also about women's traditions. You have the blues singer Shug Avery, and then you have Seeley is also an expert needleswoman. You could say that these are very traditional things. Sewing is, Seeley's not reading books. Seeley's not writing a dissertation. So yes, she doesn't do those things, but she does write. She does write, and her sister Nettie is part of a scripted culture because she does get formal learning and she writes more or less standard English. So her letters to Seeley are a contrast to the orality of Seeley's letters. Nettie's are not that oral. So you can also say that there is a dialogic interface between the scripted and the oral through this letter writing. So going back to Seeley's needle, she's an expert needleswoman, and she had a very battered life. Her stepdad, I just mentioned I spoke about him. She was also beaten up by her present husband. I mean, beating was a kind of very natural thing. So your wife is not listening, beat her up. You know, that sort of ethic, you could say, practice. So she was beaten up by her husband, and this is a lesbian novel. That we cannot deny, it is. And in fact, there is very, very explicit and frank sexual content in the novel, undisguised, between Seeley and Shakib. But now the question as to whether her life, her experience of violence and rape had anything to do with, I mean, these are not questions that I'm going to get into. There is celebration of the love of a woman for a woman. And it is very frank, and it is extremely celebratory. And where Shagavari speaks about nature as being God, she says, God loved them feelings. God loved them feelings. Okay, so I guess this kind of brings me to the end of my talk. And I will now read out to you that section where Shagavari introduces the idea of. Okay, let me read out another letter, which will highlight to you how innocent Siri was. That she had given bad advice. I mean, her stepson married and his wife was not listening, and he came and complained, and the father said, beat her up, and Seeley also said, beat her up. And Seeley said that because the wife, Sophia, was kind of arrogant towards Seeley, as though Seeley did not have much of a being and was an inconsequential person. So Seeley can't sleep. She can't sleep. It shows how pure she was. She can't sleep because something is bothering her. So this is the letter. Dear God, for over a month I have trouble sleeping. I stay up late as I can before Mr. Dash start complaining about the price of kerosene. Then I soak myself in a warm bath with milk and Epsom salts. Then sprinkle little witch hazel on my pillow and curtain out all the moonlight. Sometimes I get a few hours sleep. Then just when it looked like it ought to be getting good, I wakes up. At first I get up quick and drink some milk. Then I think about counting fence posts. Then I think about reading the Bible. What it is? I asked myself. A little voice saying, something you done wrong, somebody's spirit you sin against, maybe. Okay. So now I'm coming to this part where Shagavari speaks about nature. So this is Seeley narrating what Shagavari said. Quote, she said, my first step from the old white man, that is the Christian, the God of the Bible, as the blacks and maybe the rest of the world think him to be. So my first step from the old white man was trees, then air, then birds, then other people. But when one day, when I was sitting quiet and feeling like a motherless child, which I was, it come to me, that feeling of being part of everything, not separate at all. I knew that if I cut a tree, my arm would bleed. And I laughed and I cried and I ran all around the house. I knew just what it was. In fact, when it happened, you can't miss it. Okay. So this is the celebration of nature. There are other passages which are just as beautiful. There's one political thing that I'm reading out from here. I see it right now, where Seeley says, "Do the mayor listen to anything colored say?" So there's politics there. That the mayor, the white mayor, does not listen to anything that colored people say. So that really brings me to the end of my talk. I will read the last letter out, and I have something to say about the epistolary format. That is, some of you may know of the short story, Rabindranath short story, Street Patra. Then there is a very important text written by the Senegalese writer Mariama Ba called Une si longue lettre, or So Long a Letter. Now, these are all letters that women write, and here Seeley writes letters. Somehow, the letter, of course, is immediate, personal, direct, it is all those things. It probably approximates the voice speaking much more than any other format would allow. But the letter is also to be read as symbolic of the letter, as in occur. So a woman writing the letter, entering scripted culture, and causing a kind of epistemological shift in culture. The woman who writes, writing, reading and writing always empower a person. And this is a story that we've heard over and over again, and we never tire of hearing this. And so this text is a celebration of both the oral word and the written word. Now I will read the last letter out to you all. It's also very beautiful. It's ultimately community. Celie gets her family back. Shag Avery, in the meantime, had fallen in love with a boy 20 years younger to her. I mean, these things keep happening. But then she goes off, and then she comes back. So in the end, they're all together. And I did not tell you that Celie kind of sets up a business in making pants. She made very good pants. And the man, Alfred, his name is mentioned towards the end, who was her husband and who mistreated her in the beginning, but later on he grows to be friends with her. And he says that the more I ask questions, the more I love. The more I try to know about life, the more I love. So love is this great value that is established in this text. This is how the letter goes. Dear God, dear stars, dear trees, dear sky, dear peoples, dear everything, dear God, thank you for bringing my sister Nettie and our children home. And then I'm not going to read the entire essay out. It is that they all sit together, and on the 4th of July, which is the date of America's independence from England, they say that that is the white person's celebration. Let us celebrate on our own. So this is, I bring my lecture to a close.
Well, I was actually lost in the story as well as the lecture. I think it was equally an experience of listening to the story as well as discussing it academically that you provided us. Well, I will definitely come back to the formality part of delivering a note of thanks, a proper note of thanks. But I think before that, I should open this session to the audience now. I'm sure they may have things to ask. And with your permission, ma'am, ওরা যদি বাংলাতে প্রশ্ন করে, মানে অনেক সময় ওরা একটু বেশি কমফর্টেবল হয় বাংলাতে প্রশ্ন টশ্ন করলে, তো আমি একটু ওদেরকে সে ব্যাপারটাও বলে রাখি। আমাদের স্টুডেন্টদের বিশেষ করে বলছি, তোমরা যদি বাংলাতে প্রশ্ন করো তাতেও কোনো অসুবিধা নেই, তবে ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড নয়েজটা একটু খেয়াল রেখে, মানে কারোর যদি ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ডে খুব নয়েজি কোনো সিচুয়েশন থাকে চ্যাট বক্সেও টাইপ করে দিতে পারো, আমি প্রশ্নটি পড়ে দেবো।
কোনো অসুবিধে নেই, একটুও লজ্জা পেও না। তোমাদের মতন করে দেখো, আমি তো এটা টোটালি একটা স্টুডেন্ট ওরিয়েন্টেড লেকচার দিইনি, আমি অনেক কিছু শক্ত জিনিস এনেছিলাম, কিন্তু এর থেকে কিছুটাও যদি তোমরা গ্রহণ করে থাকতে পারো তাহলে আমার খুব ভালো লাগবে। এবং প্লিজ তোমরা কিন্তু গো আহেড আর
Okay,
আস্ক
ma'am.
ইউর কোয়েশ্চেন্স।
Okay, I think Tanmoy is going to ask. Tanmoy is our student. Tanmoy, please introduce yourself and ask.
Okay, so ma'am, my name is Tanmay Mandol. Uh, এবং আমি আমার যে কোয়েশ্চেনটা আমি সেটা বলছি। যেটা কোয়েশ্চেন হচ্ছে আমার যে এই কালার পার্পল বইটি যে একবার শুনেছিলাম নাকি ব্যান্ড হয়েছিল বা দেখেছিও আমি, এটা মানে এটা হওয়াটার কারণটা কি?
কারণটা হচ্ছে ওর লেসবিয়ান কন্টেন্টটা খুব পাওয়ারফুল, লেসবিয়ান কন্টেন্ট আছে, সেক্স বিটুইন উইমেন, তো সেটা একটা কারণ হতে পারে।
Ma'am, another question. In the color purple, why does Sally say that God must be slave? And what does she mean? আসলে
গড
গডকে তো আমরা, হ্যাঁ
Uh,
হ্যাঁ,
Tanmoy,
গড
please
গড
মাস্ট
repeat
বি
the
স্লিপ।
quote. Tanmoy, please repeat the quote. আরেকবার একটু আস্তে আস্তে repeat করো।
In the color purple, why does Silly say that God must be slave?
গড মাস্ট বি কি ট্রি, আমি বুঝতে পারছি না।
I think he's তন্ময় তুমি টাইপ করে দাও, তন্ময় টাইপ করে দাও, ঠিক আছে?
ওকে ওকে ওকে।
আচ্ছা,
আরেকটু
গড মাস্ট বি
স্টুডেন্ট,
স্লিপ।
meanwhile we have had another question. তন্ময় টাইপ করুক, তার মধ্যে রাজকুমার দাস is asking, ma'am, my question is Nettie a contrasted character from Silly, and why the fathers are very cruel at the time to abuse their daughters?
হ্যাঁ, নেটি ইজ ডেফিনেটলি কন্ট্রাস্ট টু সিলি ইন দ্য সেন্স যে, আমি বাংলাতে বলছি, নেটি লেখাপড়া করে। এখন সিলিকে স্কুল থেকে বার করে নিয়েছিল তার বাবা, ওরা ভাবতো বাবা, কিন্তু অনেক পরে জানতে পারে যে ওটা বাবা নয়, ওটা স্টেপ বাবা। তাহলে কিন্তু অনেক বছর ভেবেছে যে বাবাই ওইসব কাণ্ড করেছে। ভাবো, ও একটা বাচ্চা মেয়ের এই জিনিসটা মানে এটাকে অ্যাবসর্ব করা ঠিক কতটা শক্ত হতে পারে। মানে দ্য নভেল ইজ অলসো প্রুফ অফ দ্য রেজিলিয়েন্স অফ দ্য হিউম্যান স্পিরিট। The human being will not only endure but prevail, যেটা ফকনারের বিখ্যাত উক্তি। যে নেটি লেখাপড়া করে, নেটি লেখাপড়া করার সুযোগ পায় এবং তার ফলে নেটি অনেক শুদ্ধ ইংরেজিতে লেখে এবং ডেফিনেটলি কন্ট্রাস্ট। কিন্তু তার থেকেও বড় কথা হচ্ছে যে দুজনের মধ্যে অসম্ভব ভালোবাসা, মানে সিস্টারহুড জিনিসটা অ্যালিস ওয়াকারে খুব পাওয়ারফুল। বুঝতে পেরেছো তো? উইমেন্স কমিউনিটি, যেটা বললাম ম্যাট্রিলিনিয়াল, যে মার থেকে যে ট্রেডিশন আসছে আমার কাছে সেটাই ইম্পর্টেন্ট। আমি পুরুষতান্ত্রিক কিচ্ছু নেব না। দ্যাট ইজ হার পলিটিক্স, দ্যাট ইজ অলসো হার পলিটিক্স। The matrilineal is a very, very important aspect of Black women's criticism, their feminist theory. ঠিক আছে, সুতরাং কন্ট্রাস্ট তো ডেফিনেটলি দিচ্ছে, সেখানেই একটা কন্ট্রাস্ট বিটুইন ওরাল অ্যান্ড স্ক্রিপ্টেড হচ্ছে। কিন্তু সিলি ছোটবেলায় নেটিকে খুব বাঁচাতো। ওর বাবা যে, সে স্টেপ ড্যাড নেটিকেও টার্গেট করেছিল, কিন্তু সিলি সর্বক্ষণ ছোট বোনকে বাঁচাতো। তো নেটির সেটা মনে আছে যে দিদি আমাকে কিভাবে বাঁচাতো। সেজন্য এই যে সিলির মধ্যে একটা অসাধারণ ভালোবাসবার ক্ষমতা আছে। তো এই জন্য বনে বনে যে পারস্পরিক ভালোবাসা, সেটা এত গাঢ়, এত গভীর, যে সেটাই কিন্তু মোদ্দা কথা। তবে তার মধ্যে এটা ডেফিনেটলি একটা স্ট্রিম সিন অফ দ্য টেক্সট, যে লেখাপড়ারও মারাত্মক ভ্যালিউ আছে, এটাও আছে। ঠিক আছে?
Okay, that was a wonderful response. We have had 3 questions that are nearly the same, so I would suggest that you respond to that together. But I should also mention that this has been discussed during the lecture. But anyway, technical issues can be there. Probably the listeners could not catch those bits. But I think many of our listeners here are very curious to know why she actually is choosing the color purple of all the colors. Probably with the hinge on that, it could have been the color black, but why
It could
color
have been,
purple?
yes. Exactly. আর পার্পলের মধ্যে একটা গোছের there's something very enigmatic about purple also. নাকি প্রশ্নটা কি কি জিজ্ঞেস করেছে?
Yes, I read out the questions as is. Why is the novel called The Color Purple? Then this is from Rafia Naz. Then there is Shankar Shil. Shankar is asking, my question is why Alice Walker chose this name. She could have chosen another, I think, name, but he actually means color. And what does the color symbolize? That is the color purple. And then Deep, our very own student, is also asking why is it called the color purple. So as I said, I think the hinge is on the choice of the color.
Yeah, the color purple, first of all, it stands for beauty in nature. You know, you can certainly read it in a very obvious sense. That purple is a very gorgeous color, a very grand color, a very, it's not a color that you can bypass. If you see purple, then you stop and look at purple. You recognize its, you know, its grandeur. It's not something, it's not some pale color that you hardly notice and you walk past. It's a grand color, it's a riveting color, it's a compelling color. And it's also an enigmatic color, if you ask me. That it does not have any, although purple passion, I believe passion can be purple. You can get purple angry also, you know, purple in anger. That is also possible. But the color purple, uh, leaving aside those interpretations, that it's a beautiful color. It's beauty. It's beautiful. It's something beautiful in nature, and that needs to be acknowledged. So it could just be acknowledge the beautiful, and then it becomes an exploration of that beautiful within the contexts of Black life, their enormous deprivations, enormous oppressions, enormous sadness. But I would say that the color purple also stands for the color black. That black is beautiful. Black has to be recognized. Black is unavoidable. So you have to, that is where you read the politics of the text. This is a text that you cannot write about without entering the question of politics. This is a very, very political text where color is a very political context and text. I want to introduce you to one very famous quote by W.E.B. Du Bois, who was again a Black philosopher at the beginning of the 20th century. Du Bois writes, he was an American, he writes, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. That is a quote that you should remember. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. So color is very important. And the color purple stands for the color black. It implies the color black. But it also implies, it also means, it is also symbolic of all things that are beautiful. And that it is important to look at things, it is important to acknowledge the beauty that surrounds us.
Okay. So now we have Tonmoy's question typed. Tonmoy is actually quoting that oft quoted expression from the novel, God must be sleep, without any, apostrophe for the fact that I as far as I remember, it was God must be asleep, but she wrote God must be sleep. So
God must be asleep. Yeah.
so he
Well,
is
that is
asking you
it.
to comment on that.
Yeah. That is why I mentioned an analogous text, Riders to the Sea. That there is a Christian God there too. There's a priest. And Moria's already lost 6 sons. And the 7th one, Bartley, has gone out to the sea. And Moria is crying. She thinks he's going to die. And Kathleen and Nora, the 2 sisters, they are discussing amongst themselves. The priest said, the young priest said, that God will not leave her without no son. Does that happen? That doesn't happen. It is a godless world. It is a world where nature, a very ferocious face of nature prevails, maybe corresponding to the classical notion of destiny, the kind of destiny that overpowers Oedipus. And what had Oedipus done? What was his crime? He was struck down by a terrible destiny. So Riders to the Sea is very classical, as you well know. So God is asleep. I mean, look, you may be God-fearing, I'm God-fearing, so I, probably, won't take this much further. But I mean, when young children, babies were killed in the concentration camps of the Second World War, where was God then? So the experience of countless peoples, marginal peoples, particular ethnicities, women, where is God when those terrible rapes take place? We have this theory of karma. Hindus have that karma explains everything. But it's sometimes very hard to accept that. And where was God? So it seems like, they had centuries of oppression, the black people. I can refer you, I mean, you're too young for this, so you really can't, it's not a good reference, but there is a book called Black Skin, White Masks, written by a black psychiatrist called Franz Fanon, who was studying medicine in Paris in the 1920s. And he said that I was walking in the street and a little white girl, she clutched at her mother's hand and said, look, look, mother, look, a black man. So, to be the object of other people's unkind gaze. And also to be treated as non-existent. That is also there. The blacks have suffered that also. That white people don't see them. So he uses the words ontological uncertainty. আমি কি বেঁচে আছি আদৌ? আমাকে তো কেউ দেখতে পাচ্ছে না। আমি কি আছি? না আমি নেই। তারপর রালফ এলিসনের একখানা বিখ্যাত নভেল আছে দ্য ইনভিজিবল ম্যান বলে, সেটা কালো লেখক ছিলেন 1950s-এ, যে আমাকে তো কেউ দেখতে পাচ্ছে না, সাদাদের কাছে তো আমি নেই, আমি ইনভিজিবল। তখন অপারেশন নানা ফর্মস আছে অপারেশনের, সেই জন্য এই জন্য যে গড ঘুমোচ্ছেন, তিনি জেগে নেই। তাই তো শেষের দিকে সিলি আর ডিয়ার গড চিঠি লেখেই না, একদম শেষেরটা লিখেছে, সেখানে সবকিছু গাছপালা, উইন্ড, এয়ার সবকিছুকে নিয়ে এসছে। ও আর লেখে না, ও শুধু ডিয়ার্স নেটি লিখতো। মাঝপথে গিয়ে ও ডিয়ার গড লেখা বন্ধ করে দিল। যবে থেকে জানতে পারলো যে নেটি বেঁচে আছে, তখন ও ডিয়ার নেটি লিখত।
Okay, that was a wonderful interaction. And I was also getting reminded of a very old and famous at that point of time song used in Bangla theater, কেউ কথা বলো না ভগবান নিদ্রা গিয়েছেন,
Yeah.
while listening to all that. Sanghamitra has asked a question. It's a very interesting question. Uh,
Yeah.
is the matrilineality because of the fact that among the African American slaves, paternity was difficult to establish, or is African culture matrilineal?
It's a good question. এখানে let me sort of break my answer up into parts. একটা জিনিস, Sam, this is that in Africa and also in African American communities, there is a concept called other mothering. That is that women are strong, the women are strong. Even in most of Morrison's novels, I mean, they may do very drastic things, terrible things, like Setha in Beloved. But it is women who kind of, carry life forward. So in African communities also, I mean, in African communities, one man had like, I don't know, 10 wives or something like that. So apparently there was no jealousy amongst these wives, and they were all good friends, and they all looked after each other's children. So there's this concept of other mothering, which I've come across in recent times, that is there amongst women in the African American community too. That if say a mother has to go out and work in the plantations, or young mother has to go out and do something else, then other women of the community, and we have our Didima, Thakuma, Mashima, Kakima, we have all that too. We have them too. But that other women step in to take care of the child. So women are a very important part of the fabric of African American society. And matrilineal, see, even Virginia Woolf, Sanghamitra, is in search of matrilineal. She's disgusted with the fact that the British Library has only a shelf where women's books written by women are available. So she goes in search. She was a brilliant woman. So she goes in search of women's texts. And she finds people like Hannah More and God knows who else, and maybe they didn't write very profound stuff, but they wrote. She talks about a woman who tied a cow's bell to her foot. And it would somehow it would wake her up every day at 4 o'clock in the morning, and she would get up to learn Latin and Greek. So this is how women, even our Kadumbini Ganguly, in her spare time, she looked after so many children and knitted clothes for them. So women are like wonderful creatures who can do a lot of stuff. So matrilineal as a deliberate politics, politics of criticism, politics of critical inquiry, that I want to know who my foremother was. I want to know what my foremother did. That is where my identity lies. Does that answer your question, or did you ask something else?
Sanghamitra, if you could respond. Okay, yeah, she has responded. Well,
Yes.
there are some personal comments, so I will not read that out.
Yeah.
But yes, she is very happy with your response. Okay, now moving on. But before moving on, I must ask you, ma'am. I can see there are at least 2 to 3 different types of question, but would it be possible for you to go on for this long? I mean, I
Of course,
really
of
don't want
course.
to tire.
Yes, yes. This is my way to give back. This is my mothering dimension, if you like.
Okay.
I'd love to. I'll answer them all.
Okay.
So
So
go ahead.
once again, I thank you from the students and the audiences end for being so patient. Okay, so now I move on to the other questions, but I can already see. I mean, this is probably the beauty of discussion sessions. That is, one thing leads to the other. So I can already notice that while commenting on the quote from the text referred by Tanmoy, you have already spoken at length about what God really stands for in the text. But I can already see that Bishal, one of our students, Bishal has asked about the significance of God's mention, presence, etc. in the text. So, if you want to comment anything further on that,
No, I've already said
yeah,
enough
yeah,
on
I
the,
think
but there
you
were
have.
some other questions. There were one or
Yeah,
two
yeah,
I
yeah,
noticed in the
yeah,
chat.
yeah, yeah. I'm
So,
just going. I'm
yeah.
just going serially because I
Mm.
fear that there are ample number of comments praising the lecture, so questions might get lost. Okay, so then that is Bishal. Okay, now we have Amisha Jaiswal, who has, I think, a very interesting question. How do Neti's letters differ from Silly's, or whether there are any similarities?
Amisha has left, by the way. I
Okay,
saw that.
okay, okay,
I mentioned that too. Celi's letters are that of an uneducated person. So she spells like she talks, and most of her, well, many of her spellings are wrong. Whereas Nettie's obeys the laws of standard English, English grammar, as well as, and she has a wider experience of the world. There's politics there too. She goes to Africa to work with the Africans. So that is how Africa, the wider context of Africa, is woven into this text. That being black means being African, being of African heritage, of African lineage. That Africa is our kind of great mother. That's there in the text. So Nettie brings in the dimension of Africa very powerful, which is interesting.
okay, okay. Amisha had left another question I can see, but it's incomplete, so I will leave the first portion out because it's I really can't make any sense of it. But the second part I think is interesting. Can any of the characters here be described as good role models? How does the color purple illustrate the concept to their children or something like that? I think it's a case of typo.
Yeah, role models, as we're not looking for conventional role models. No. If the answer is conventional role model, then no. But yes, again, Celie, for her ability to love, and she validates family. Family is one of the most conventional of you know what should I say? I'm the social institution, and it demands we have family almost. I mean, almost born coded with family feeling and family values. So Celie is very family oriented. She loves, even when they are her stepchildren, she loves them. Even when they are the children of, I mean, all her little siblings, she used to take care of them. So Celie is, yes, she's a role model in the way, in her capacity to love others. Her patience, endurance, yes, I would certainly call her a role model. She's probably the only one in the text, and also Nettie. Because Shug Avery is she's a very provocative figure. She's a very controversial figure. That's the word I want, controversial figure. She's a blues singer, she's rich, and she sleeps with both men and with women. And but the thing about Shug is that she too, there's a line in the text where, I mean, Celie's husband is also in love with Shug, and Celie is also in love with Shug. And this is towards the end when her husband and she have grown close together, not sexually, but as people. And he says, uh, I love Shug or something. And Celie says, Shug knows how to love back. So that's again a very important line. Shug knows how to love back. And everybody somehow loved Shug. So, but then she falls in love with this young, he's probably 19 and she's in her mid 40s. So this sort of thing, like I'm sorry, I mean, I'm too conventional, I suppose, for this sort of thing. But so that way she's the unpredictable artist, you know. She can shock you with some of her actions. She's totally free. She's completely free. She does what she wants to do, and she doesn't care two hoots about society. So, so I don't know. I mean, are artists ever role models? Artists are laws unto themselves. Artists, I don't know. Well, yes, her freedom, her courage, her ability to live life on her own terms, that is wonderful about her, and her originality. The way she cracks the code that by loving that a tree, if you cut a tree, then you bleed or you ought to bleed. That's very powerful. So a character who can say that and who can mean that is also definitely a role model. So we don't have role models like you have in Charles Dickens, you know, where you have this kind of woman figure who is who is cleaning vegetables and cutting them and just looking after the house and just doing that sort of thing. You know, that might have been a nice 19th century Victorian role model. But so you don't get that sort of thing in in writing by women. You don't get that kind of figure at all. You get these unconventional figures who have these vastly redeeming traits, who have these, you know, like outstanding, almost shocking qualities. They can shock you with they can sort of jolt you with how powerful, how strong, how unusual. That's the word. The Shug is very unusual. So if you can appreciate what is unusual, then you can appreciate Shug.
Okay, that was a very detailed response. Our student Deep had asked a question which I think has almost been answered by the response that you just gave. Well, I first read out the question that he typed as is, and then I think he means to say something more as well. Well, he exactly typed who is the real hero in The Color Purple, but I think he wants to suggest whether the novel at all can be viewed in terms of conventional concept of heroism or such things. But I think you have already answered that as well.
No, I'll answer it
Yeah,
again.
please.
Rajkumar, first of all, you know, there is no hero in this novel. Sorry to disappoint you, but there's no hero in this novel. No, I guess there is, I mean, Celie is a heroine, I think. She is. For the kinds of battles that she wages, and to come out of it raped at the age of 40, mother at the age of 50, thinking that her children were dead, married to a man who did not care for her at all but was interested in her little sister, and who often beat her up. That even after all this, Celie doesn't stop loving. And she doesn't, she's not mean towards anyone. She's not giving hatred back, but just carrying on this business. You know, figures like that in our lives, we are all like that to a certain extent, but figures like this who just carry on the business of caring, caring, every day of their lives. With these figures are huge. And Celia is like that. So this extremely ungood looking, ungrammatical, this very ugly black woman who is ignorant, and eventually she turns out to be a homosexual, which is fine. I mean, all I'm saying is it's not the conventional idea of the hero or the heroine. But she has this inordinate capacity to love and to carry on the business of loving and caring every day, and not to turn anyone away. And then also to grasp love when it comes her way. She falls in love with Shug Avery. When Shug also falls in love with her, they have a relationship. And it is a beautiful one, where Shug makes her feel loved. Shug was the first person who made Celie feel that she was valuable and that she was loved. I mean, isn't that important? And the whole world, everybody, most people are treating you like trash. There comes along someone who treats you with love. I mean, that's huge. So I would say that yes, there is a heroine in this text, and that is Celia.
Yes, that was again a very in-depth analysis. Tanmoy had asked another question, but since Tanmoy's questions have been answered on multiple occasions, I will first move to the other. That's one question that we have from Rafia. Rafia is asking, why does Celie, a victim of long-term abuse, recommend that Harpo beat Sophia?
Yeah. So that was not nice. That was not nice. And that she regrets it. And she says sorry to Sophia for that. That was because this was early on in her marriage, uh, because Sophia had a lot of self-esteem. I mean, Sophia also hit a white person. She was rude to the mayor's wife. She had that kind of gumption. So Sophia kind of looked down upon Celie. She never actually told her that, but that was evident in her attitude. And that had hurt Celie. And since Sophia was a young girl, very young girl, so Celie had the advantage of age over her. So when Harpo, her stepson, he in fact asked Celie that why doesn't Sophia obey me the way you obey Dad, obey my father? So I forget what Celie said. She must have said that, I mean, I am like that. I obey everyone. And then his father told Harpo that the way to make a woman obey is to beat her up. So I think he tried to beat her up and got beaten up in turn too. Because Sophia was a big woman and very, very feisty, very capable, very good with building stuff and all that. Very, in a certain, again, conventional sense, masculine. Harpo is feminine and Sophia is masculine. In what ways? Conventionally. Like Sophia can build a roof and she can do stuff like that. And she says Harpo likes to cook and he likes to do these things. So, as I said, please don't think that I am advancing these stereotypical notions. I'm just saying that Sophia is like that and Harpo is like this. And then so Harpo, once again, when he raises this question of how to make Sophia listen to him, then the father says, beat her, and Celie also says, beat her. But remember, I read out that letter to you, that Celie couldn't go to sleep because she said that. And then Sophia comes and charges her and returns the curtains that Celie had made for her new house. And then Celie says, I'm sorry. She said, why did you say this to Harpo? Sophia charges her. Take your stuff back. I don't want it. And then Seeley says, I'm sorry. So, see, I mean, characters are going to make mistakes as well. Otherwise, they would not be human. I mean, we are not dealing with any kind of, absolute goodness. I mean, so, so I think she's allowed that one moment of uncharitable behavior.
Okay, okay. So that's pretty much all of it. But Tanmoy once again was wondering whether the choice of the format of epistolary novel serve any particular purpose. So
I
you have
answered that.
answered. You have
Yeah,
answered that. You
answered
have
that.
answered
Yeah.
that. But
Because the epistolary format is very immediate, it's very personal, it's very direct. You actually hear the voice that is speaking. That is why that's just one answer. The other theoretical things I said, I'm not going to
yeah,
get into that.
that will
Yeah.
actually
Mm,
lead to
mm,
repeating the first
mm.
entire 40, nearly 30 to 40 minutes of the discussion. It's not
Yeah. Okay.
possible. So I hope Tanmoy would understand. Okay, yes, he has responded that he got it. Okay, so the rest I am not reading out. There are people who have thanked you for the presentation. uh, Jhinuk Basu is the last one to comment. Uh, it's always so enriching to hear, ma'am. I think she's one of your old students, and
She
her
is.
discussions are thought provoking at many different levels. My heartfelt thanks to ma'am and the organizing college. Okay, so now I am closing the Q&A session and moving on to the last but a very important part of the event, that is, well, I don't know if I should call this a valedictory, but at least I will be trying to deliver a proper heartfelt thanks. Now, I was lost thinking a lot of things. I mean, I happen to have been an interested reader of African American writings in general and African American women's writings as well. And I had told Madam initially during one of our informal discussions that I always felt mesmerized by Morrison. Frankly speaking, I did not have the opportunity to be taught, to be introduced to the wonderful world of Alice Walker. I mean, I have tried myself to get familiarized with her work, her politics, but I think today a completely new world has opened to me, and thanks to you. And I am sure the audience, the rest of the audience here would share the same and maybe a little more. I mean, I often feel that it's quite partial for the organizers to only be allowed to deliver the note of thanks. I often feel that the audience could have done a much better job. Probably they would have come up with many more interesting feedbacks, but we would definitely not go to that direction because time is important. And most importantly, I cannot help telling this to everyone that despite having multiple difficulties and a very hectic schedule, she has been with us for nearly 2 hours. So I should thank you once again, and maybe in future we would try to organize some event either in our college or for some public forum where we could also hear your thoughts about the study of music, because I think you have a lot to say along those lines as well. And I request the listeners here, please go through her YouTube uploads. She has uploaded many interesting works. She has been a very active documentary maker, that, as I earlier mentioned. But once again, I thank you once again for this very, very engaging discussion. You almost entertained us as well as enriched us with your academic discussion and bits and pieces from Walker's wonderful writing. So it was wonderful. It was a wonderful experience.
Thank you, Devaditya. I had a good time too. See, for me, academics is eros, you know. I mean, in the world, the life of the intellect is the most erotic thing that I know. So it's really the most joyous area for me. So I never regret, uh, uh, giving, partaking in any of this. So
Thank you, ma'am. Wish you a very relaxing and happy weekend ahead, and all the best for your future endeavors. May you be enlightening and enriching us with your wonderful academic output. So that's all from our end for the day.
okay, thank you all. Bye,
Yeah.
bye,
Okay.
bye.
Okay. Now I'm ending the call for everyone. So thank you for being with us.